On a seemingly ordinary night in the spring of 1989 in Central Park, New York, the lives of 5 black friends from the same Harlem school turned into a nightmare. Desmond Williams, Jamal Atkins, Terrence Brown, Kevin Johnson, and Marcus Reed were typical boys, aged 15 to 17, passionate about street football. Their daily routine involved running to Central Park after school, using backpacks as goalposts and playing until sunset. That day they laughed and played as usual, unaware that their lives were about to change forever. The next day, the New York Police Department launched a manhunt for suspects. Nearly 24 black and Latino youths were aggressively detained and interrogated, among them Desmond, Jamal, Terrence, Kevin, and Marcus. None of them had prior police records. In fact, they were just regular students. But detectives insisted they must know something since they had been in the park that night. Under intense pressure, threats, and exhaustion, the story crafted by the police began to take shape into a supposed confession from the 5 boys, one built on contradictions and repeated phrases that had been fed to them by the interrogators. The families of these teenagers, mostly working class and with limited resources, were devastated to see their sons accused of such a brutal crime. Desperate to close the case quickly, law enforcement used intimidation tactics, including hours of interrogation without lawyers, playing on their fears, and making empty promises like, "You can go home if you just confess what happened." No physical evidence linked the boys to the crime, but the so-called recorded confessions became a flimsy yet decisive piece of evidence for the police department. The media, in turn, fueled the public's anger, describing the suspects as wild youth gangs who hunted innocent victims in Central Park. When the case reached the district attorney's office, prosecutors saw it as a political opportunity. They wanted to appear tough on crime, and with public pressure at its peak, they pushed the boys to trial. The defense had few resources. Many of the court-appointed lawyers were either inexperienced or overburdened. Meanwhile, rumors spread that even the mayor was receiving daily phone calls from influential businesspeople and activists demanding exemplary justice. The heated atmosphere led to a swift verdict. Despite glaring inconsistencies in the case, all 5 were found guilty. During the week the jury delivered its verdict, the entire country debated the case. Some argued that the boys were victims of racial prejudice and a biased justice system. Others, swayed by the media, believed the convictions were proof that criminals were finally being punished. The fact remained that Desmond, Jamal, Terrence, Kevin, and Marcus were sent to juvenile detention centers, facing an uncertain and grim future they had never imagined. As the courtroom doors closed, reality revealed its cruelty. A harsh judge, with little patience for the defense, handed down sentences ranging from 5 to 10 years, based on charges of assault and attempted murder. Even after the initial sentences, prosecutors sought harsher penalties. Many feared that once they turned 18, they would be transferred to adult prisons and face even longer sentences. It was the beginning of a saga filled with pain, injustice, and an unrelenting battle for the truth. Their transition into the juvenile detention system was a brutal shock. Used to playing in Harlem's courts and attending school, they now found themselves locked away, unsure of what lay ahead. The environment was hostile despite being a juvenile facility. Internal gangs and unspoken rules dominated. Newcomers who failed to show toughness were either bullied or attacked. Ironically, skin color did not guarantee solidarity. There were territorial disputes and power struggles among different groups. Desmond, always the most talkative and outgoing, experienced solitary confinement for the first time.
Accused by a guard of inciting unrest merely for proclaiming my innocence, I was locked in a cramped, dimly lit cell. I endured long hours of oppressive silence, hearing only the slow drip of a pipe and the distant screams of other detainees. That experience forever altered my view of the world.
Outside, his family desperately tried to appeal for a case review, but to no avail. Kevin, the youngest of the group, battled panic daily. At just 15, he couldn't understand how things had gone so terribly wrong.
I cried silently before sleeping, remembering the football games I played in Central Park, dreaming of one day earning a sports scholarship. Now I was being forced into fights, defending myself from threats, and carrying the label of the Central Park monster. The few juvenile center staff members who showed empathy were quickly silenced by superiors determined to maintain order without questions.
Outside, the case's impact continued to ripple. Politicians used the case as a rallying cry against crime. Community leaders from Harlem and Brooklyn protested, arguing that the boys were victims of racism and that the entire prosecution was a legal farce. However, major newspapers insisted that the recorded confessions were solid proof, repeatedly broadcasting images of the boys handcuffed, with frightened faces and disoriented gazes. The overwhelming public pressure prevented any swift review of the case, and many lawyers were hesitant to get involved in such a politically charged controversy. Over time, the convictions were reinforced, and upon turning 18, some of the boys were transferred to adult prisons, where the environment was even more sinister.
I was the first to experience this change. There was no longer any distinction between me and criminals convicted of premeditated murder. Sharing a cell with dangerous individuals led to recurring nightmares. I would wake up drenched in sweat, haunted by the screams from the night I was beaten by a group of inmates who wanted to show who was in charge.
To survive, Terrence learned to withdraw into himself, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Jamal, on the other hand, tried to hold on to faith and hope. He began attending religious gatherings inside the prison and found solace in the occasional visits from his mother and sister. But every time he stepped out of the makeshift chapel, he was confronted by the harsh reality of the fetid hallways. Death loomed weekly, and fights often ended in stabbings. It was impossible to forget the world outside, where he had once dreamed of studying music and pursuing a career. All he could do was cling to the belief that one day, the truth would come to light. Meanwhile, Marcus, the strongest and most athletic of the group, tried to protect his friends, standing up to violent guards and inmates who abused their power.
During one of his visits, my aunt revealed that a group of civil rights activists had started looking into our case. There were promises of a possible retrial, but nothing was certain, and it could take years. In prison, time lost all meaning. Each day felt like an eternity, and hope became a luxury.
Each of the 5 boys tried to maintain their sanity in their own way, but they knew that society still saw them as guilty of a brutal crime. As the years passed, prison life became an increasing burden, and the stigma they carried made them targets for both veteran criminals and racist guards. The promise of a new trial or evidence that could prove their innocence remained distant, and the media frenzy that once surrounded them gradually faded, replaced by new headlines about violence and political scandals. The years passed slowly, mercilessly, as if each day in prison were a test of physical and mental survival. Desmond, Jamal, Terrence, Kevin, and Marcus, now grown men, felt as if the world was evolving outside while they remained stuck in time. Social media emerged, presidents changed, historic events unfolded, all beyond the bars and walls that kept them segregated. Their families fought for them from the outside, some facing financial struggles, others moving to different states. The distance and travel expenses made visits rarer, but a spark of hope began to shine when civil rights groups, pro bono lawyers, and organizations dedicated to reviewing wrongful convictions took another look at their case. Among these institutions was the Liberty Justice Foundation, which specialized in investigating cases involving coerced confessions. Its founder, senior attorney Patricia Roberts, noticed glaring inconsistencies in the boys' initial statements and uncovered forensic documents that had never been presented to the jury during the trial. Forensic pathology reports indicated that the timing of the attack on the woman in the park did not align with the police's narrative against the boys. Additionally, DNA samples collected at the crime scene did not match any of the 5. Patricia and her team of investigators launched a legal battle to reopen the case. This process required patience and solid evidence. There was strong resistance from the original investigators, who feared damage to the reputation of the New York Police Department. Politicians involved in the case worried that a review would expose their failures or, even worse, reveal institutional racism. The prosecution also resisted, arguing that the jury's verdict should be respected. During this time, Kevin and Marcus suffered assaults in prison. Guards who were either complicit or directly involved did nothing to help them. Terrence was thrown into solitary confinement after reacting to a cellmate's racist insults. Desmond lost his father, who passed away without ever seeing his son freed. With each blow, with each loss, the weight of injustice became nearly unbearable. Jamal tried to keep his religious faith alive, leading small prayer groups among inmates while waiting for updates on their appeal. Then, an unexpected event changed everything. An inmate named Reyes, already serving time for another heinous crime, spontaneously confessed to a prison chaplain that he was the real perpetrator of the Central Park attack. Reyes provided details that only the true assailant could have known, and even pointed out inconsistencies in the official narrative that had convicted the 5 young men. At first, many doubted his confession, suspecting he was trying to reduce his sentence. But when authorities ordered a new DNA test, the results confirmed the truth. The DNA matched Reyes and not any of the 5 convicted men. The revelation sent shockwaves through the system. The Liberty Justice Foundation, led by Patricia Roberts, quickly presented Reyes's confession and the DNA confirmation as irrefutable proof of the Central Park Five's innocence. Prosecutors attempted to create obstacles, but under public pressure, now more aware of wrongful convictions, and with overwhelming evidence in favor of the young men, the courts finally agreed to review the case. When each of the 5 received the news that the real perpetrator had confessed, their reactions varied: tears, disbelief, anger, relief. There was a mixture of joy at the prospect of freedom and deep resentment over having lost more than a decade, which had eventually stretched into nearly 15, 20, even 30 years behind bars. No financial compensation or public apology could restore the youth that had been stolen from them. Still, the truth had finally surfaced, bringing with it the promise of leaving their cells behind and breathing the air of freedom once more. The confession and DNA match from Reyes caused an earthquake in New York's justice system. The case was reopened urgently, now free from the political interference that had once used it as a tool for personal gain. An extraordinary hearing was scheduled. In a packed courtroom, Patricia Roberts presented every piece of evidence, each contradiction in the original trial, the forensic reports that had been ignored, and the testimony of the real perpetrator. The families of the 5 men attended, many of them no longer holding the same innocence they once had, but filled with hope that long-delayed justice was finally within reach. The judge, visibly uncomfortable with the evidence being laid out, announced the overturning of their convictions and the immediate release of Desmond, Jamal, Terrence, Kevin, and Marcus. The courtroom erupted in emotion. The 5 men, who had once been frightened boys, had walked in shackled, but were now watching their chains being removed as people applauded and shouted words of support. Many of them no longer recognized the city outside. 30 years had passed. Personal computers, the internet, modern cell phones, a world entirely different from the one they had left behind as teenagers. The same media that had once vilified them now sought them out for interviews. Politicians appeared with speeches of regret and promises to reform the judicial system. However, no public apology could erase the psychological and physical scars they carried. Terrence bore stab wounds across his torso, reminders of prison fights. Desmond still woke up in panic, believing he was trapped in solitary confinement. Kevin, the youngest, had spent half his life incarcerated, never having the chance to complete his education in a normal way. Marked by the system's failure, he struggled to figure out how to start over. Even so, as they stepped out of the courtroom, they were greeted by a group singing hymns of hope. Civil rights organizations promised support for their reintegration, offering psychological and legal assistance. The city, now divided, debated the colossal failure that had unfolded in Central Park.
Money can't buy back the youth they stole from me. I was 16 when they took me. I'm leaving here almost 50.
The Central Park Five's story became a symbol of systemic racism and the dangers of media and political hysteria. Their case ignited discussions on coerced confessions, police misconduct, and the manipulation of public opinion. It led to documentaries, films, and legal debates, emphasizing the critical need for caution in prosecuting suspects and ensuring due process for all. Each of the 5 took a different path after their release, but their fight for justice left a lasting mark on history.